Thank you, everyone. So, as maybe more for the Polish members of the audience, as the first slide suggests, I'm going to talk about difficult things in this talk on gender, sexual orientation, politics of exclusion. Though, while talking about difficult things, I hope to end on a note of maybe some hope, maybe some directions that we could go and things we can do. Let's see. So, first I thought I'd just start with the theme of the conference in terms of building bridges. My whole talk is kind of dancing around relational frames, so why not begin with frames of coordination and opposition? In terms of frames of coordination, here's the start of my story in Heidelberg, and this past summer in Warsaw. It's really relationships within the ACBS community that had allowed me to come here, led to my visa invite. I can't say, unfortunately, Asha Dudek isn't here because she's home with her new baby. But through my long connection with her through ACBS. And Steve Hayes had reached out, I'm going to focus on him for a moment. He'd reached out to me when he thought it might be time for a book on mindfulness and acceptance around sexual and gender minority people. If that might be something I'd take on. This has really shaped a lot of my career. He's working with me now with other colleagues as we look for responses to the legacy of behavior therapy and conversion therapy, attempts to impose or force change on LGBT people. But this brings us to frames of opposition. It was the first decade of the 1910s that anti-Semitism and the popularity of the elders of the protocols of the Elders of Zion became popular in Poland, leading to my great-grandparents to flee Warsaw and wind up in the US. So my physical manifestation here today is due to frames of opposition to bias in Poland. My physical presence here today is due to newer bias in Poland that drew me back to look at the struggles and the power and the strength of the queer community here as they're working to combat bias that's generally used for political ends. And I mentioned Hayes before because there's a different sort of legacy with ACBS. This is a quote from a paper he published in '84 when he was on a postdoctoral fellowship with David Barlow. Rakers and his colleagues have described a case of a young child who was called a sissy, queer, and fag because he displayed cross-sex related motor behaviors. The child internalized these labels and described himself similarly. If this continued without treatment, it would not be surprising to find the subsequent development of a homosexual arousal pattern. Our field in Poland, but our field globally, is still struggling with what to do with faggy-acting little boys. And this is what brings me to Poland. This is what motivates my work. And I started with frames of coordination because I don't think that's Hayes' whole story. But he noted in his apology video before the World Conference that his first ever grant was an award to conduct this research. So it poses this question for all of us. How wound into the DNA of ACBS is this challenge? Do we own this legacy? Do we work against this legacy? Is this what led us to this moment? And that mysterious cascade of cause and effect that ripples through time? Is this what I owe my career to? Do you owe knowing your career to this? And frames of coordination and opposition set the boundaries of our compassion. Think about the differences in responses in Poland with Syrian versus Ukrainian refugees. Why are some others more like us than the wrong kind? And I'm not saying that those frames of coordination don't have their palpable meaning. I have a friend in Warsaw, I was visiting this last week. I had to take some extra days to see friends who said, you don't understand that for a Pole like me, looking at the news and seeing those Soviet-era prefab railway stations and villages being bombed in Ukraine looks like places I've seen in Poland. It hits differently. But how do we, so how do you consider the time in your life, particularly for those of you who identify as cisgender or heterosexual, How have you reflected on your own history, identities, and messages that you've received about sexuality and gender in the world? Do you ever ask yourself those questions? So let's take a step back. Now that everyone's attention is focused, we all entered our field to alleviate human suffering. We all entered this field because we hope that we do good in the world. And every human has a gender identity. Every human has an experience of themselves as a sexual being. My aspirations, we can move between these lines and find some places to talk about the political weight of these, the sociological weight of these, but remember that we're always talking about individual lives. These are individual people that are affected and are hurt. So where is it safe to be a queer or trans person in the world today? Well, there are a number of studies or surveys that have been conducted for decades that show or argue that Spain actually seems to be the winner. Whether you're looking at the laws, at social attitudes, at places where people could be themselves. So how great is Spain? Well, 41% of LGBTQ people in Spain say they've been harassed in the past year. 34% report avoiding areas of their city for fear of harassment or violence. There was a 24-year-old nursing student, Samuel Luis, last summer, who was beaten to death outside of a club, holding his phone on a FaceTime when a group of guys walking by decided maybe he was filming them. Hate crimes rose 43% in the first half of last year in Spain. So this is the safest place in the world. Our field also does not create a context for safety. We've acted as the stewards of sexuality and gender since we started defining these terms, since Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin popularized the word homosexuality, created the word transsexuality to refer to what we would now refer to as transgender. But these terms still don't necessarily fit the experiences of people that are being talked about. We still cling to DSM notions like gender dysphoria that doesn't always describe all trans experiences. We know that queer and trans people use therapy more in the absence of a mental health diagnosis, possibly because of socio-familial rejection, social unsafety. There's no other minoritized group in the world where there's a risk that your parents, as your primary attachment figures, may one day decide to withdraw that completely. So it makes sense that individuals in the community might have ruptures that they want to work on. But this doesn't mean that we give better care. Even though most psychologists in surveys across the Western world are likely to have LGBTQ clients, they're highly unlikely in any country to have actually received any training on what to do. Even prompts on whether or not to be affirmative are rare. And in surveys, queer and trans people describe therapists as either being over-focused, everything must be, let's come back to why you think you're transgender, let's come back to why you think you're gay, or uninformed and avoiding the topic completely. Well, we're focused on your depression, I don't really need to hear about your struggles dating. The Trevor Project, which is a national hotline in the US for queer and trans and questioning teens, conducted a survey a couple years back that found that 5% of those youth had been exposed to conversion therapy efforts, which more than doubled the rate of suicide among that population. I'm gonna skip that for now, just keep on time. Because another area that's received a lot of attention lately is that there's bias the second that queer and trans people walk in the door. Craig Rodriguez has conducted a series of studies in the past couple years, very creatively parsing out that no matter how you control for whether or not there are actual personality disorder features or characterological features that a client arrives with, the moment you mention a minoritized sexual orientation, your clinician is more likely to diagnose you with borderline personality disorder. Significantly more so. if you identify as bisexual. What does that mean? So we know that clinicians are partial to over-pathologizing the interpersonal behavior of LGBT people, that societal assumptions that maybe there's something a little wrong with queer and trans people, that bleeds over into our field in an unquestioned way when you consider whether our programs do or don't talk about it, that our clients don't come to us necessarily expecting safety, and they shouldn't expect safety from us. So I just wanted to show some slides just to see where it hits you. So you think about what you're exposed to day to day. I realize these are all images from Poland, but notice where they land for you as a person, a citizen of the EU. I love this one. Stop gender. Who's even paused gender in this room? That's a great transition. What is gender ideology? What is LGBT ideology? There are volumes growing among sociologists of how do we define this? What do politicians mean when they talk about this? Well, kind of anything, whatever the boogeyman is, right? Gender ideology is just what we don't want. Gender ideology is just stuff talking about gender that scares us. It's empty. At its heart, this concern about separating gender from biological sex, that it undermines community norms. We've always had biological sex and the diversity within, and cultures have always found a way to have genders that vary across time, across space. LGBT ideology sometimes gets thrown around in this part of Europe, and it's an even more meaningless term. There's no clear belief that can be attributed to it except, I don't know, maybe don't kill gay people. Some politicians have used this phrase with comparison to Bolshevism and other ideologies, but it's not coherent. And when we think about these global moral panics, when we think about the region, Russia signed its first LGBT anti-propaganda bill in 2013 in the context of speech suggesting that it's harmful for children to even see images or know of LGBT people. This was mirrored in Hungary's 2021 anti-LGBT law, which they wrote into the part of the legal code that governs penalties for pedophilia, as if they could force this connection. And this law adds fines for any program with LGBT content that's aired before 8 p.m. Poland started legislative debate last year. I wasn't able to find what came of that. It's been a busy week. But these laws ignore the existence of queer children. Who's supposed to be protected? There's this assumption that every child is somehow straight and cisgender and going to be exposed and violated. No, children are diverse, and children are going to be excluded and ostracized or pushed towards suicidal ideology, considering suicide. These misinformation trends are not only phenomena of Central and Eastern Europe. There's frequent invocation of this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria that you see in Western countries right now. This idea that children, particularly teen girls, might become susceptible to messages they see online, might decide that it's hard to be a woman in today's world, and that it would be better to be a man, that there's social contagion, is something that pops up around the globe. As best I can tell, though, this term was never used before Littman, the scientist who published a study on this that's frequently cited around the world, came up with it for her recruitment drive. And despite media coverage saying that that this was a survey about young people showing a speed at which they're identifying with other genders. If you read Littman's original articles, all she's ever done is survey parents about their unhappiness about having trans children, contributing to this rhetoric of being unwanted and being unsafe. Attempts to follow up with children to see if there's any truth to this phenomena doesn't seem to support the idea. There was a great study Bauer published last year looking to see, if the time between a teen saying that or coming out as trans or questioning their gender and receiving medical care, if it's particularly short, can we find evidence that there's a peer contagion effect? Are they more likely to belong to online forums? That's one of the big assertions. It's all, the internet teaching kids to be trans. And no evidence was found for this. Their long wait group averaged about 5 years, and they were no more or less likely to have trans-identified friends or to belong to online groups where they talked about their identity. Last summer, Budapest yet again, and I heard tell that Poland have hosted large, well-attended conferences funded by speakers from the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, formerly known as the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. There are US groups like the World Congress of Families that fund or support treatment or focused conferences around Central and Eastern Europe just to promote the idea that perhaps a traumatic, a background with trauma led to diversity of sexual orientation and gender identity. Abusing research on sexual fluidity by Lisa Diamond to suggest, well, if our sexuality might change over the lifespan, surely that means we could nudge it in therapy. But there's never been evidence that we could nudge it in therapy. Let's see. There are also claims in this model that have started to pop up in top journals like the Archives of Sexual Behavior that minority stress, the primary lens that we use to examine in the field the different ways that bias trickles down and affects queer and trans people, that it might just be better explained by neuroticism, particularly neuroticism among gay men because of our psychological similarities to women. There's a lot to unpack in their claims, but we don't have time for all of that. But researchers have looked and they've found that even when you control for neuroticism, all of the differences you see appear to come from bias. When you look at Christina Olson's work in the Pacific Northwest in the US, where we're finally getting the first generations of trans and gender diverse children whose parents have loved and accepted them their whole lives, we've noticed there's no psychological or behavioral difference between them and any other child their age in the region. It all comes down to not just societal, but family acceptance. One study I conducted while I was here involved traveling around the region from Poland to Croatia, speaking with provider activists. Because one of the things that I had learned traveling through the region is that many activists realize how much mental health claims are at the core of ways that queer and trans people are abused. And they wind up training as therapists. And many therapists learn they found themselves on the front line, and it invigorates them as activists. And so interviewing queer and trans activist providers, I explored how do you hold these roles and still find social safety? Both of these roles undermine our ability to just go get loose at a club and explore and experience people. Where do they garner support? What messages do they receive in their training? We've only just begun coding the transcripts, but I figured by way of illustration, every queer man in the group made reference to going to Berlin as an escape from oppression in their various countries. So this is a random building in Berlin. If you know, you know. So what does psychological science tell us about gender? Well, there seems to be a cyclical reinforcement of behaviors, a way in which gender is constructed and reconstructed that tells us about our roles in society. But beyond that, it's incredibly fluid. It's incredibly dynamic, a process. I'm going through this a little quickly, but I'm happy to share slides later. But in this way, gender roles vary drastically across cultures. We behave and we dress very differently depending on where in the world we were born. And everywhere, our gender appears equally rigid and natural. It just appears to be a feature of how humans organize ourselves, how we select our roles. And what is it with sexual fluidity? What do we know about sexuality? Lisa Diamond's asserted that there are two systems that overlap that comprise a sexual orientation. We have our sexual arousal component, which is one piece. That's, you look, you become aroused, or whatever sense invigorates you. But we also have an affectional attachment process that is bidirectional, that can orient toward any gender. If you required a mother to survive when you were born, then so many infants would have died through our prehistory. If you required a father as your only caretaker, so many children could have died. No, we're born with the capacity to feel affection and desire closeness with any human, and then we also have an arousal capacity, and these appear to intersect. So yeah, sometimes our experiences change over time. Some of us have more or less flexibility with that arousal. But this is just a piece of common human diversity that most of us don't learn about in our graduate programs. For those of you who were at the World Conference of ACBS in Seattle years back, Lisa Diamond gave a talk there saying, conservative governments often say if we're more accepting, or that accepting places have more LGBT people because of this recruitment effect, because of exposing children to these messages. There is some truth to it. The more liberal a society, you do find more people in same-sex relationships. You do find more people expressing their authentic gender. It's because you won't die. It's because you're not fired or let go from your job. We know from data on same-sex couples that those who are exclusively same-sex attracted make up the smallest margin, double that of individuals who identify as bisexual, and even more who identify as mostly straight. So when there's freedom to choose, when there's freedom to love, of course you see more. But this isn't recruitment. This is a world where people are simply safe. And psychology's also had a mixed effect on our abilities to reduce bias in this area. There was a study by LaCour and Green that purported to reduce bias around same-sex marriage with door-to-door discussions. They were quickly found to have faked their data. There was no, the contact hypothesis that says that simply seeing people in the media reduces bias hasn't particularly held up. It might feed into tokenism. If you have one representative of a minoritized group that seems okay, then they become an exception. But simple representation isn't enough. Brookman and Calla, the scientist who discovered that data appeared to be faked, felt like it was too precious and a hypothesis to have swept into the dustbins of history, though. So with their team of trans and non-binary volunteers, they came up with a protocol that emphasized the idea of vulnerable discussions and perspective taking. Here's what it's actually like to walk through life in my shoes for a day. And so in their protocol, where individuals would go door to door and say, I'm not going to try and talk you out of your views about gender. I just want to share with you what life is like for me. With a 10-minute conversation led to enduring changes 6 months out. If perspective taking is key to reducing bias here, this is a tool that we have in ACBS, right? This is something we utilize. It all begs the question on whether or not it's our job as social scientists, as clinicians, as behaviorists, to change social attitudes that result in harm? Do you claim this as a value that you put into effect in your work? I believe that when social attitudes change in a manner that results harm, and harms we see in our clinical work, that we do have a platform and a role where we can take action on this. So I want to walk through a model and relational frame theory that climate change activists within our community have highlighted, of how do we use language, how do we set up language in a way where we can keep hope and keep open to the possibility of change. RFT says language language is the action of framing events relationally. So that's all we're doing. How do we relate these things together? Now then, deictic frames. So deictic frame, I'm not going to explain what deictic frames are, but when we orient toward the future, these frames can be empowering for personal choice. You can only marry your same-sex spouse when your parents, with your parents present if you've come out to your parents. These are if-then relations. You have to take a brave step to have an outcome you want. You can only live your gender authentically if you're willing to dress, behave, or speak in ways that feel authentic and open you up to the possibility of violence in a violent world. Every action that takes advantage of future-oriented framing can help us gear toward change. And it's not just toward the future, but it's the if-then relations of now. This is a photo from a photo series by an artist and a photographer here in Poland who was wanting to envision the normalization of queer intimacy in public spaces. So this is outside the Palace of Science and Culture in Warsaw. It's this if-then framing that says, what relation can I build between if I do this, this is the world I'll have? Well, a world where affection in public is possible is only possible in a place where people take that chance. And maybe you'll risk danger, maybe there will be negative responses, but only the first time, the second time. If everyone chose to engage in this way or take bold moves, things change. It can be helpful when we engage in communities to differentiate between what's the if-then relation we've built that's workable, and what's the one that maybe helps me feel like I'm doing something but doesn't. How many of you have signed, I don't know, thousands of web petitions that you've never seen anything come from? I mean, thinking about rule-governed behavior and stimulus equivalence, the biggest shift in the world, and I know that this isn't always popular in the more radical activist groups I've been associated with, but the biggest shifts in the world around bias have happened socially when marriage equality has been recognized. Use of the word marriage, that linguistic term, and all its associations with family, with acceptance, with walking a path of faith. We don't seem to be able to disentangle this. This is why so many churches around the world fight to prevent marriage equality or offer watered-down solutions like civil unions. The effect might be shrinking, but a recent study even showed that in places with marriage equality, workplace discrimination goes down. Reports of workplace discrimination to governmental bodies goes down. Lawsuits related to it go down. Housing discrimination goes down. And then looking to our past, Glenda Russell's a leading LGBT psychologist in the US who emphasizes the role of resilience in our communities, of thinking where we've been. We don't always know where we've been, though. There's a great film on Netflix, Operation Hyacinth, about persecution of gay men here in Poland in the 80s by the Soviet government. But many of these records are not clear. There's in almost every nation in Central and Eastern Europe, you will not find a single history of its queer community. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. I mean, the word homosexuality was created by Kerbeni Budapest, who wrote a letter to Hirschfeld. There were active queer communities across this part of Europe. But we don't know our history. We don't know how people struggled and survived. It's important that we embrace that. In the data I collected from Poland, again, preliminary analyses are all that's done. More than a quarter were trans and non-binary, half were bisexual identified. So we had a very diverse sample. We know that psychological flexibility mediated that relationship between the distress of daily bias that was encountered and psychological distress. It was also associated with greater activism. But activism in turn seems to be related to greater distress and more contact with daily bias. So the more individuals are motivated to act a change, the more it actually might open them up to violence or bias. There are a number of open questions. I'm just about wrapping up. Number of open questions here. The challenge I have for you, I've been conducting a systematic review with colleagues of US-based studies in the ACT world. And what we found looking at identities of minoritized populations is that ACT does okay with like ethnicity and race. Almost no studies report on sexual orientation and gender identity. The few that do, well, there's, Maria had mentioned one on smoking cessation that just came out. There are a couple on HIV medication adherence. What about the general smoking cessation studies? Do they report that data? No. What about adherence to diabetes medication? None of these others work. So what can you do in your practice today? What can you do in your research today to make sure that we're creating a science that's actually relevant for everyone? And I just want to quickly note that in my time in Poland, it wasn't all about the bleak oppression or it wasn't all about anti-LGBT movements. I had a chance with the queer and trans community to dance at clubs, see people find romance dressed to fit their gender. The big beefy guy who'd always wear a little pearl necklace at vegan ramen in Warsaw. I know people who fly to Denmark and get married, engage in activism, march in the streets, volunteer, raise their children, kiss and hold hands in public sometimes, and like I said, when in doubt, they can always go to Berlin and party. So I want to end with this quote: "When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it's better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive." So thank you.